Okay, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Tegan. I'm in the second year of the MPhil in Development Studies. And I am going to take a moment to introduce our speaker today.
You have to come up.
Do I?
I'll change the owl. I'll change the owl.
Oh,
Then you're in
I can
camera.
come up. I mean, I'm reading from my laptop.
Okay, I'll change the owl. We can adapt. Okay. You can read, I think.
Okay. So it is both an honor and a personal joy to introduce Dr. Yvonne Su, my former supervisor and a scholar whose work continues to inspire me deeply. Dr. Su is the director of the Center for Refugee Studies and an assistant professor in the Department of Equity Studies at York University in Canada. She holds a PhD in political science and international development from the University of Guelph and an MSc in refugee and forced migration studies from the University of Oxford. And she has an academic foundation that has shaped her into the interdisciplinary migration expert she is today. Dr. Su's research spans forced migration, queer migration, climate change adaptation, and climate immobilities with a focus on the global south, particularly Latin America and the ASEAN region. Her work is not only academically rigorous, but also deeply impactful. She has secured over $7.6 million in external research funding, including grants from the New Frontiers in Research Fund and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Her groundbreaking concept of intersecting precarity, examining the layered vulnerabilities of the LGBTQ plus migrants and refugees in Latin America, has reshaped how we understand migration and marginalization. In the ASEAN region, her decade-long research on climate change adaptation and Indigenous knowledge systems has been cited in major reports, including the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report. Beyond her impressive academic credentials, Dr. Su is a compassionate and visionary leader. Her commitment to decolonizing research and centering marginalized voices is evident in her community-based, policy-oriented approach. She is also a brilliant collaborator working with transdisciplinary teams across the globe to develop innovative tools like I've just found this out today, as I read through your detailed.
How did you not know this?
A color meter to detect environmental toxins, empowering Indigenous communities to protect their lands. As her former supervisee, I can personally attest to her generosity as a mentor, her intellectual curiosity, and her unwavering dedication to creating a more just and equitable world. And so it is a privilege for me to welcome you today here, Yvonne, and we're really excited to hear your insights. So please welcome Yvonne, and you can go ahead and get started.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. I'm here to talk about a really important topic that has come into news. I'm sure many of you have been paying attention to, and has also been changing like by the hour, right? So I want to talk about it in more of a long-term form in terms of the trends regarding remittances, which is something that has been around for a long time, but I think has really been more vogue, in the last 10 years, 20 years, and has now come back to the fore because of the changes in the humanitarian sector. So my talk is when USAID freezes, who pays? The dangerous myth of remittances in global crises. And the thing is, you might not have heard about this or thought about this too much because of the flood the zone approach, because we're told to be so overwhelmed by all the various things. So I'm actually trying to advocate for a more long-term view of these things, because I have been studying remittances for the last 10 years. So today, I'll be bringing you more of perspective that is going to be broad, to look at the humanitarian sector, to look at the situation that's happening now, and then I'll narrow down to my PhD research and my book project, which is focused on the Philippines. So you can apply what we're talking about into something more specific. I'm sure many of you guys saw this headline just 2 days ago, I think, about that it's been confirmed 83% of USAID programs have been terminated in just 6 weeks. I don't know if some of you know people who are working for USAID or like had academics who had grants. I had a grant that was impacted. We're in the application process and it just stopped. And that was not USAID, that was just another government grant. But this crackdown has impacted many people and have left many people unsure of what the future of the humanitarian sector looks like. But first, I think the important thing is when we talk about aid, when we talk about money, and we just talk about remittances, we're always talking about billions and trillions. And I often find those really hard to grasp. What is a billion? What is a trillion? And we talk about multiple trillions. What does that look like? So this is a trick that I borrowed from Marshall Burke, who is a professor at Stanford. Thank you. And he looks at billions and trillions through billionaires. So this is Elon Musk. I've rounded down his net worth. It's actually 342 billion. I've made it an even 300 because of all of the turmoil with Tesla stocks. So we'll just keep it at 300 billion. And we also have Bezos. And that's 200 billion. I've also rounded him down a little bit. We're just talking about how to measure billions and trillions using billionaires. Thank you all for coming. You guys can sit up here too.
Yeah, go ahead. One of you can sit over here.
And that, my friends, is what 1 trillion in billionaires look like. I don't know if that's scary to you, that a trillion is just 3 Elon Musks and a Bezos, but that is what a trillion in terms of worth is. So I'll move on now to talk about the ODA and OECD countries. One sec, I'm just gonna lock the screen now because there's lots of people in the room. This is the beauty of the owl. Okay, so it should just be me. All right. We only have 2023 data. So in 2023, the official development assistance for all the countries that are contributing to it is 1 Bezos, right? So 200 billion. What is the gross national income of the 32 member states of the OECD, I think I spelled it wrong, Development Assistance Committee in 2023? 603 trillion. Like, can you wrap your head around what 603 trillion could be, is? Like, what is that? Just mountains of money? Well, in billionaires, it's 1, 2, 3 times 23, right? So just imagine how much money we're talking about, right? Of all these rich countries with these big economies, and development aid was only 200 billion. So if you take a fraction of that, the ODA was only, which was only 223 billion in 2023, represents only 0.37%. I think the news makes it seem like the aid that's given is a lot. But at the end of the day, when you look at it in a bigger picture, it's peanuts. It's nothing, right? So we just look at the US, right? Because that's what's been in the news rates recently. It's 22 trillion is their gross national income. And the budget of the USAID that was cut, that was in 2023. What do you think that was? I have it right there. Sorry, I was supposed to animate it, but it's only 1/10 of Elon Musk's worth. So just to show you, that's 1/10 of his face, right? If we're using the equation, right? So it bothers me, and I'm sure it bothers you, that one of the richest men in the world made it his priority to cut 40 billion, which is not even 1/10 of his own worth, right? So, and this is aid that's going to emergency healthcare. It's going to food programs, right? There were stories of women who had experimental contraceptives in them that had to be immediately taken out because of stop work orders. Like, it's insane what happened, right? But it's important to illustrate the magnitude and the scale of things and to put things in perspective. Now let's pivot to remittances. And again, you'll understand why remittances play a role because it's also very attractive in terms of numbers. So I'll just make you guess. How much remittances will be sent in 2030, do you think? Remittances are the funds that migrants send home. Anybody wanna take a guess?
30 billion.
30 billion. Any higher?
30 trillion.
Not 30 trillion. I didn't teach her that, okay? I know she was my student, but
100 billion?
no, more.
230.
Guys. 1 trillion. 3 Elons and a Bezos, right? $1 trillion is gonna be sent in 2030. That is genuinely an incredible number if you think about what remittances are, right? Individual funds sent by family members working abroad back home, right? But the issue with a very attractive number is that people see it as more of a statistic. They start to imagine things and attribute things to it as this one cohesive 1 trillion, right? And in the fallout of USAID, ID's lack of funding and collapse, there's been various narratives. So this was just from a LinkedIn post, but I saw many like it, which says, you don't have to read the whole thing, but essentially it's saying like the idea that, you know, Africa doesn't really need foreign aid, right? Because if you look at it, if you go on to the bottom, furthermore, remittances to Africa reached 100 billion in 2023, constituting 6% of the continent's gross domestic product. The assets of high net worth individuals and remittances surpassed ODA to Africa, which was 42 billion, as well as foreign direct investment was 48 billion. When you just look at things as numbers, this argument really makes perfect logical sense. You don't really need to interrogate it. That's great. There's more remittances than ODA, right? And foreign direct investment. Yay, remittances, right? Let's use it for good. And then you also see it's already happening with IOM saying that, you know, perhaps climate change can be addressed by the diaspora, right? Remittances, again, with its 1 trillion shiny number, it can solve various problems. But the question that I'm asking you to ask in general is, can remittances fill the gap? And perhaps the tougher question, which is, should remittances fill the gap? So what I'm describing is remittance euphoria, right? The World Bank has famously claimed that a 10% increase in per capita official remittances may lead to a 3.5% decline in the share of poor people. Wow, doesn't that seem incredible? Just increase remittances by 10% and 3.5% of poor people will be gone. They will be leveled up, right? Remittances have been called the hidden force in global economics, a hidden force that needs to be revealed and used, again, for good. And then lastly, remittances are dollars wrapped with love. You know, there's truth to these statements, but there's also a lot of things that these statements hide, right? And that is a more human approach to remittances, that there are human beings behind these dollar signs, right? So I want to bring forward the stories behind the statistics. I want to draw attention to the invisible cost of sending and receiving remittances, right? And mom or dad has to go abroad, right? And family members, children, women, grandparents are often left behind, right? And they can be gone for a very long time. And if you haven't noticed, that's me. You can't see if you can see the resemblance. That's young Yvonne. And the reason I argue for a human-centered approach to remittances is because I was raised on remittances. So my father had to leave China 2 months before I was born. After Tiananmen Square, the country was in chaos and opportunity came from the leave. But my mom was 6 months pregnant, but he had to take it because that's kind of how these opportunities come. So he left. And for 6 years, he worked in North America and he sent funds home to my mom, who had to manage it for me and my brother. And that's my brother's arm, but obviously I have main character energy, so I and after 6 years, my dad was able to apply for asylum and then became a refugee in Canada, and we were able to be reunited. But I saw firsthand the challenges of sending and receiving remittances. I lived through the social, cultural, economic consequences of remittances, both good and bad, right? And of course, I ended up being able to go to Canada, but that's not the case for everybody, for most people, right? And most importantly, we are a human family, right? We are not just a statistic, and that 1 trillion doesn't speak to my family. I can't touch it. Yes, we may contribute to it, but we don't have control over this. We're not a homogeneous group, right? So my book project, The Myth of Remittances, focuses on untangling this and asking and arguing for a human-centered approach to remittances because we're reaching the 1 trillion mark in 2030. And because there's so much excitement and there's so much to capitalize off that big number. So I want to remind people in these moments where it's easy to say remittances will fill the gap, to say we need to remember the people behind it and not look at them just as statistics. And now I will share a case study with you. This is Typhoon Haiyan. Sorry, there's 1 or 2 pictures that are not great, but it's also important to show the magnitude of the disaster. It was the strongest storm ever recorded. There was a giant storm surge that brought in 13 large tanker ships, those giant ones with the shipping containers, into the community. Officially, 6,500 people died, officially. But the unofficial number is anywhere from 20 to 30,000 because they had to put people in mass graves. And a bunch of people also died as a result of post-disaster trauma and complications. And as a side note, that doesn't actually count into the official numbers, right? How the UN or other groups count the death toll is on impact, right? So it was a very serious disaster that really destroyed the central part of the Philippines. It took about a week for aid to come. Famously, Anderson Cooper was able to arrive 4 days after, and it pissed off everybody. Because they thought, how did this silver fox get in here before the national government or other people? And the president at the time got caught with a memo saying, I need stories that are positive. I need you guys to promote me and our communities and helping each other because Anderson Cooper has just made the Philippines look really bad, that we weren't able to get there before before America was, right? So as a result, there were actually lots of positive stories about people helping each other as well as remittances because of a mandate like this. You know, sometimes you don't know how these things work. You think it's very organic, but no, it's unfortunately to a certain extent planted in this case. So one of the really positive stories, and again, this goes back to us trying to understand numbers, is that the diaspora played the most direct and important role for many affected communities. In a year-to-year comparison, remittances to the Philippines rose by 600 million in the first 3 months after the disaster. When you read that, you're like, wow, 600 million in 3 months, 200 million a month. That is so much money that the diaspora was able to mobilize so quickly and send to the Philippines. This is amazing. Remittances is amazing. Remittances are quick, they're responsive, and they're resilient to shock. They're great. But, you know, I come from a remittance family. And unless Chinese and Filipinos are dramatically different when it comes to remittances, I know firsthand that it's not so easy. Right? There's lots of conflict. There's lots of intra-family fights over remittances. Your brother needs us to send money again because his car broke down again, right? I'm not sending that money. Or there are 20 typhoons that hit the Philippines regularly every year. We can't send money every single typhoon. So I just wanted to problematize it. I wanted to understand, again, the stories behind the statistics. And I wanted to challenge this euphoria. And in a very academic way, this was my PhD research question. Under what conditions are households able to turn access to remittances after major disasters to mobilize them, right? So you might know somebody who's a migrant, but can you mobilize that into actual cash money? And there is a very real, practical humanitarian implication of this. It's just for the first time in Typhoon Haiyan, this is a beneficiary selection form that the UN shelter cluster made that was used by all 80 of the NGOs that are on the ground. And one of the questions says, do you receive remittances, right? And if you receive remittances, if you don't receive remittances, you get 5 points. If you receive remittances, you lose 5 points, right? But the important thing is to know is the text. Not in receipts of overseas remittances / financial support for/from relatives nationally or internationally. What do you think is missing? I'll just tell you because it's a bit tricky. Frequency. right? Tegan could be getting $100 a month, right? And I could be getting $100 quarterly, or I can be getting $100 just for my birthday. But those are both remittances. Or Tegan could be receiving $10,000 quarterly, and I receive $100 a month. That frequency difference is huge. That scale difference, the volume difference is also huge. But this question for 5 points doesn't account for that. I asked in my field work, I did 500 surveys and 72 interviews. And I asked many of them, do they remember this form? Do they remember these questions? And they said, after the typhoon, so many people came to our door and they just blurted questions at us. And we just answered. I don't remember that question. I don't remember if I said yes or no. Right? And that makes sense. And they definitely do not understand the scoring system. That is not explained to them. Imagine if you got struck by a disaster and someone tells you, if you answer something a certain way, you will gain points. If you answer something a different way, you lose points, right? It will change the way you answer. But as a result of them being so overwhelmed by, of course, the disaster, but also how many people are coming to the door, like there's very consequential, consequences. It's very consequential, right? To have a question like this. And because I am very cheeky, I found the person who was responsible for this question. And I asked them very important questions like, why did you ask this question? And the answer was very simple. And it was simply, well, the Philippines receives 10% of its GDP is remittances. So of course, 10% of the population would receive remittances. I was like, okay. And then I said, did you know that where Typhoon Haiyan struck, which was central Philippines, mainly around Tagum City and the Visayas, that's the second poorest region in all of Philippines. And she went, oh, okay. And I said, did you know that they only sent out 2.5% of all of the overseas foreign workers last year? Oh, well, I just assumed 10% for the whole country means 10% for everybody, right? Just like a trickle down kind of situation. So it did not occur to the person in Red Cross that had created this form that ended up being shared by 80 organizations and used, that this 10% that they had made this assumption of did not apply to the specific region, which was one of the poorest regions, right? Did not understand anything about frequency, did not really understand remittances at all. Just thought it was something important. Now, the decolonial aspect of it, and this is why that part is really important in research, is that when I spoke with local NGOs, they pushed back. And they said, I don't think you should include this question. It's too personal, right? And they said, no, but remittances is such a big deal, 10%, 10%. And they strong-armed and forced that question on there. When this was brought to Nepal in the next disaster, local people, local NGOs said the same thing, and they were able to resist. And that question was not on the Nepal cluster question. But this is really important, it goes to show like you really need to do local consultation, you really need local people involved because this is what happens. You read one statistic and it goes all the way down to individuals. And again, this determines if you get aid or not. This determines if you get resettled into a home or not, right? And it's a very vague question. And overall, the research gap is that there's this optimism and the potential of social capital, which is a concept I'll explain later, and I think some of you already know what it is, and remittances after disasters. People really want to maximize the benefits. But this ignores the insights that we've gathered from decades of migration research, which is that migration is very selective, right, and heterogeneous. And that applies to development in general. And there's a lot of inequality in terms of social capital, who has social capital, who doesn't, and both come together to create a very uneven landscape that we're engaging with. But the optimism kind of glosses all that over. The theory that I use is Lynn's network theory of social capital, which defines social capital as resources embedded in one's social networks, resources that can be accessed or mobilized. So that's the key of all of this. There's a difference between access and a difference between mobilization, and that's through the ties of your network. And if I were to apply this to your own life, I would say pop open your phone and how many contacts do you think you have? I don't know, 100, 50? Many of you guys are very popular on Instagram and TikTok and social media. You probably could have anywhere from 50 to 1,000 to 1,000,000 followers, right? You have access to all those people. So that's access, right? Now I'm gonna ask you, how many people will send you 50 bucks in 10 minutes if you were to ask? You know, somebody can talk to their millions of followers and say, I need 50 bucks in 10 minutes and get nothing or get one or two, right? Or you might think it will be your parents that might send you money or your best friend, right? So that's mobilization. There's a very big difference between access and mobilization, and that's not well spelled out in the literature. So in terms of remittances, access to remittances is having someone in your household, your family, or among your relatives that works or resides abroad. The mobilization of remittances is the ability to receive financial resources from those abroad. And now types of social capital. This is just really interesting for you, for your own life. When I learned about social capital, it just changed the way I see people, but in a good way. So you can categorize people in terms of bonding social capital. So those are your really close friends, likely your direct family members, right? People you would talk about important things, personal things with, people you would lend money to or ask for money from. And then there is bridging social capital, which is most of people in this room, like your classmates, your colleagues, you know, people who are more like acquaintances. You might not necessarily help them, give money to them, or talk about extremely private things, but they're in your circle. Maybe somebody you play football with or somebody you go to church with. Those are bridging social capital. And they do most of the time end up having different backgrounds, either religious or economic than you, but not necessarily all the time. And there's linking social capital, which could be seen as like your professors or council members, people who hold a position of power, who have access to resources. So bonding, bridging, and linking are the main social capitals to consider. So I'm just going to explain my methods, and then we'll get into some findings. So I looked at 3 heavily impacted barangays. This is like kind of like a village that was based on the fact that they were affected by the storm surge, experienced a great deal of international NGO assistance, and had an organization for overseas Filipino workers. They were all semi-urban and located near the coast. And the communities are composed of a mix of lower income and middle income, but also very few upper income households because they lived elsewhere, like in most places. I did 7 months of field work from 2015 to February 2017 over various periods, 15 expert interviews, 500 short surveys, 72 semi-structured interviews, and then 72 participant-aided sociograms. And the really cool thing is I brought it. So I'll show you on the screen, but I'll show you in person too. So how do you understand remittances, right? How do you get people to talk about these things? So my committee asked me to, back in the PhD, they asked me to do a survey. Just ask them. If somebody went up to your door and asked you how much money you receive, are you going to tell them? No. So I was like, I need something creative. So this is what you call a participant-aided sociogram. And what you see here is a name generator. So I'll pass this around. So you see they're coded. And the really cool thing about this, and I'm very proud of it, is that people academically criticize participatory approaches because it's not systematic, right? Well, this is systematic. So each post-it is coded, each name is coded, and there is also stickers and whatnot that I will show you. I think I have a slide on it. Oh, no. That represent different things. So you see the pink is for very close ties. So that's the bonding social capital. The other color is for bridging, and then the green is for linking. So those are people in positions of power, like the barangay, the village leader, for example. And then the stickers are to denote how much funds that what type of funds they gave you. A different color for money, and another color for non-financial goods like medicine or diapers or clothes, that kind of thing. And then because it's coded, I was able to systematically record it, right? And the really cool thing is that, you know, when you do it this way, it's not like a really extractive survey where I ask you a question, you give me an answer. They're just telling a story, right? So Carlos, my friend in England, was able to send me money right after the disaster. We're great friends, right? Send me good money and then also send me some diapers because he knows that I have a child. Right? That's amazing. Thank you, Carlos. And then now, but all of a sudden, I'm able to say my relationship to Carlos, where Carlos is, what was sent, and when, without me directly asking, right? Because that's just, let people talk, let them share their stories. And you can look at these. These are from testing, so they're not like actual data from the field. And then this part's a little more complicated. So how it works is like, see it as like a network, and the further you're away from the middle you are, the further away in terms of closeness you are, and then the closer you are, you know, to the person. But you can make it into basically any factors you're interested in. So I was interested in time, so I cut it up into a pizza. And again, I'll pass it around so you can see. Because another thing that's missing in the literature is time, the temporal aspect. People are very interested right after a disaster. 6 months, 1 year, boom. They want to figure out all the action, all the NGOs that came in, all the money that was sent. But, and then maybe long term, right? Maybe 10 years, 15 years, or even 5 years after. But what about the 2 years to 3 years right after? What about the period in which aid is actually gone because it's no longer an emergency after a year? So I wanted to look at it over that temporal aspect. So I made it up into a pizza. And then I wanted to know how helpful the remittances or the aid they got was to them. So instead of closeness, which is what is usually done with the sociograms, I did helpfulness to the recovery. So for example, if Carlos had sent me the money, say in a year's time, not in the first 3 months, I might say, you know what, Carlos, that was not so helpful because I actually need money right away, or I need those diapers right away. Right? So that allows you to be able to separate the type of aid. So for example, somebody had noted that they got like $10,000 from their son 3 years after, and they actually did not put that as most important because they wanted that money sooner. And by 3 years, they also had other resources to draw on. So again, you can adapt this to anything, any kind of factors you like, which is really cool. And as you see in the picture, the best part is it's tactile, right? They can pick up the Post-it and move it around. And that also helps with coming up with new names, right? So, you know, I can think of Tegan and think of Tegan's friend. That also helped me, that I did not think about when I initially put down Tegan's name, right? So this is also a great way for people to make this a more iterative process. So it's not one time, and they can move things around. Okay, and then I looked at it from on here. I'll show you a real one, whereas one was one of the test ones. So this is what it, like, at the end of the day, it looks like. Right, so you see a lot of the aid came in the beginning and there was a big gap. Right, and then you see there are different ties and different stickers and different roles. And then I also allow them to like write the little story at the end. I'll pass it around this one. And then there's also an interview, but you know, it's all, I don't have to share this, but it's all done at the same time. Now the findings, right? Because I was able to categorize them based on middle income with migrant, middle income with no migrant, and lower income with migrant, and lower income with no migrant. One of the main questions was who benefits and who is excluded from the surge of remittances that arrive after major disasters. This is the lower income group, which had 394 of the 500. So focus on this bigger circle first. So lower income, no access to migrants was 77%. That is a lot of people who don't have access, right? But again, when you see remittances as just like this big number that's able to come right after a disaster, help everybody, and you see remittances as a way to get out of poverty, you would imagine that those in the lower income would have more access. And again, this is just access, knowing a migrant, right? 23% had access to migrants. Now, the important part is the mobilization. This is during regular time, so before the disaster. And I was shocked myself, and I know the literature. Only 3% of people received regular remittances before disaster time. That's very little, right? And then the 20% did not. And this is middle income, which you could imagine is quite different, right? But again, we don't talk about it as much because we really care about remittances as a poverty alleviation mechanism. So 43 had no access, 57 had access. And of the 57, 21% received regular remittances that they can count on, right? And 36 did not. And the end for this was 106. Okay, now we're gonna look at it after a disaster, right? And imagine this was after Typhoon Haiyan, one of the strongest storms ever recorded. Anderson Cooper was there, it was covered all over the news, right? The diaspora mobilized to get funds to the ground, right? So that's what we're looking at. Oh, sorry, this is the comparison, which I don't think you need right now. It only increased by 2%. I was floored, right? After all the news, after all you understand about remittances, after everything you could imagine how nimble it is, how fast moving it is. But that just shows you the difference between access and mobilization, right? And it explains that there's actually so much going on here, right, in between, that stops people from receiving the remittances. So the next part of this is finding out why. And then when you look at the middle income, again, similarly, you would expect they were able to increase by 10%, which is a lot. So 31% of those who had access ended up receiving remittances after Typhoon Haiyan. And again, this is just the comparison, but just look. It's big, right? And then the really cool part about this exercise was my committee told me that I would not be able to get real amounts, that people would not tell me. You know, they would tell me to do a survey, but then they told me to put like categories and whatnot. And I did do categories, as you can see in that systematic printout, but people would just tell me how much they got because they felt comfortable, right? They felt that they were in control. And again, that's a more decolonial approach. Instead of me asking direct questions and expecting direct answers, I turn the table over to them, and they were able to do that exercise however they want. They can tell me all the people that helped them or just a select few, but that's their choice. And in so doing, they just told me how much they received, again, without me asking. So here, on average, middle income migrant households receive 1.74 times more remittances than lower income migrant households. So my main finding is that remittances are not a tide that lifts all boats, right? My findings confirm that when it comes to which groups benefit and which groups are excluded from the surge of remittances after a disaster, a remittance gap exists. 6.2 times more middle income households receive remittances after Haiyan than lower income households. Middle income households have a much stronger ability to mobilize remittances during disasters than lower income households. My findings support other studies that caution against the optimistic view that remittances play a significant role in post-disaster recovery. And now that I explained this to you, you kind of think, okay, that makes sense. You know, of course, the middle income household would get more remittances and have more access than lower income households. But those distinctions is just absent from more larger country level, multi-country comparisons, quant approaches. They don't get down to this. So I argue that it's important to bring both together, right? It's not about just a qualitative approach or more micro scale, right? And that tells a more human perspective, because the reality is there is going to be $1 trillion in remittances, right? And that is a real number, and all these countries and all these people have a role to play with it. But how do we bring the two together so we can create more evidence-based, holistic policies, right? I won't go over this in detail, I don't have time, but I was able to look at the factors that affect the ability of households to turn their access to migrants into remittances after disasters. And these are the 5 factors. The relation of the migrant abroad to the household, right? So you have people who are very close to you, your immediate family members, your parents, your child, your partner, right? You're able to mobilize more remittances from them than, say, like a relative or a cousin, right? The occupation of the migrants. A lot of Filipinos work abroad as domestic help, as they building the stadiums in Qatar, right? Those are low skill labor jobs that don't pay a lot and or just very hard on them to work. So depending on whether those are the jobs of your migrant, or say somebody who's doctor or engineer or whatnot abroad, you know, that also changes the type of remittances or how much you can get from them. The country the migrant is living or working in. So a lot of the people have migrants who live in the Middle East or in Asia, right, versus say America or the UK. So that changes. And of course, it's also a result of the exchange rate. Interfamily issues, which I will touch on later, and then cultural norms, which I'll also touch on later. So interfamily issues, poor family relations. Again, when you think about the 1 trillion number, when you think about this as a concept, you don't think that at the end of the day, bickering and pissing off your family members impacts, or just not talking to them, right? Impacts if you receive remittances or not. Some households asked for help and were rejected. Some households were given less than promised, and some were told NGO assistance was on the way. So, you know, because I worked in villages where multiple families that, you know, like 2 brothers or 2 sisters would be in the same community and they would have the same remittance sender, I was able to hear that, you know, you got $3,000 after the disaster, right? But you only got $200, but it's sent from the same brother. What happened, right? Then you start to hear, well, we haven't really talked in a few years after he moved away, and the disaster struck, and I got a Facebook message, but I didn't feel comfortable asking, so $200, and you're not going to know about the more money from your sister, right? You just know about what you have. Or there's situations where one person is responsible for disseminating the funds. So let's say I'm the grandma of the group, right? And I'm supposed to share it with the 10 kids, right? Well, I don't like 5 of them, right? They don't visit me enough, so I'm not going to give them anything or as much. But again, those things aren't built into understanding this concept, and there's actually so much intrafamily politics. I heard an extremely tragic story of someone who I was asked to go interview them because they had 3 siblings abroad, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. And very unfortunately for them, their partner had a seizure after Typhoon Haiyan from this trauma and the stress. So she was paralyzed. Like one side of her was paralyzed, and she was bedridden. And when I visited their home, it was like a very tragic situation, and they had only like a 1-bedroom. So I was really confused. I'm like, this does not look like the household of someone that received remittances, especially not from 3 siblings. So I, did my usual, and I asked questions. And when it came to that part, I said, so I heard you have 3 siblings abroad. And he said, yes, I do. I have 2 brothers and a sister. And I was like, wow, so do you receive remittances from them? No. Not from any of the 3? No, nothing at all. I was like, did you, again, the literature is not telling me this, but did you ever receive remittances? And they said, yes, I used to take care of my mother. And unfortunately, my mother passed away. And my mother would give me some of the remittances that she got, but then my siblings knew that I got a part because I took care of my mother. But because when my mother passed away, and I'm like getting goosebumps sharing it, the siblings stopped sending money. They said that I wasn't taking care of my mother anymore. And then I said, okay, well, what happened after Typhoon Haiyan? Like, did you tell them that your wife is paralyzed and like, I can't work and bedridden? Yes. They send any money? No. And I said, why? And they said they did not want to restart the remittance dependence again. That they thought in a way that they were able to cut off sending remittances or the obligation to send remittances after their mother died. And this idea that the siblings have to then restart because of Typhoon Haiyan and awkwardly, this is just a difficult thing to talk about, coordinate those remittances, right? If there's 3 siblings, are all 3 siblings sending the same thing? What if one person wants to send more and I want to send less? So to avoid all that, the siblings sent no money. And to avoid the continuation of the idea of remittance dependence, they sent no money. That's not what the literature would tell you, right? So understanding these human stories, this ugly side of it too, because people don't want to talk about the ugly side of remittances. They only want to see it as a positive investment. Now, there's also cultural norms. So in general, in the Philippines, and I would argue in most places around the world, it is shameful to ask for assistance, right? So, here's a quote: it's shameful to ask for assistance from relatives abroad, especially that we do not have communication for a long time. Help is something that should be offered. Again, one of the biggest typhoons ever recorded. It was around the world in the news. If I'm related to you, you should probably reach out to me and offer help to me. I shouldn't have to ask you. And then the fear of rejection. They said, what if they say no? That came up over and over again, that they could not face being told no because that was so shameful and so embarrassing for them, that they were asking for what they thought a handout. Now, there's this other thing, which is that the idea culturally that one should not collect a debt of gratitude if they cannot pay it back. Owing this debt to someone is like an interesting quote: turn yourself into a 7-Eleven for them, because you would need to be open to return the favor 24/7, 365 days of a year. So that is the idea. If that I accept help from you, I should be able to give that help and that money back to you anytime. So households that don't have that ability, or feel that they would take your money and use it and not be able to save or give you the same kind of money back, they would actually say no to the help, or they would shy away from getting the help because of that cultural debt. And then, so this was often cited as a reason for some households, they didn't end up getting money from Typhoon Haiyan. All right, I'm gonna wrap up. and answer your questions. So the main findings are these middle income households are much better placed to turn their access to migrants into remittances after disasters because they have more economic and social capital than lower income households. And more lower income households have limited to no access to migrants and those that do have access to migrants often do not have the conditions, right? The 5 conditions I laid out required to turn their limited access to migrants into remittances after disasters. And now this is the bigger picture stuff and what I want to leave you with, which is that remittances are not foreign aid and should not be seen as a replacement to foreign aid or development or government responsibilities. The 1 trillion is not centrally controlled and should not be viewed as easily controllable because it's made up of millions of households with their own needs and their own visions for their future. Any initiatives to group remittances, remittance banks, private adaptation funds by remittances, need to be done with a great deal of consultation, and I say consent, so people know where the money is going. Because these are always pitched as really good ideas. You know, we can grow your remittances 2-fold, 3-fold, right? And then you can now have more money to do that with the remittances. But people need to understand what the terms and conditions are. Can they take that money back out any time, right? In these group things, who does it impact? How long-term is it? So all of this needs to be better articulated. And I think it's important for me to say that I'm not against collective remittances. I'm not against using remittances for good. I'm against the idea that we don't see that there are humans behind it and that we use it as a statistic. And I think that's kind of where we could be heading if we're not careful. And that's it. And this is my, shoot, one last thing is the humanitarian contribution, right? And this really goes back to that beneficiary selection form that I talked about. You know, all of you guys in the room, many of you might end up working for organizations and might end up being penning those questions. So the importance of looking at research, making sure what you're doing is empirically supported, so you don't have a situation like the one that I described to you. All right, there it is. Thank you so much.
We have a few minutes for questions, but I'm just